The rain hammered against the glass, a relentless rhythm that usually lulled me to sleep. But tonight, the apartment felt wrong. The air in the living room was heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and the distinct perfume that usually lingered in the department hallways. I didn't need to turn on the light to know I wasn't alone. A shadow sat rigid on my worn secondhand sofa. It was Dr. Evelyn Thorne. The typically untouchable, high-status academic looked out of place in the gloom. She wasn't just visiting. The way she held her wet coat tight against her chest told me the truth immediately. She was hiding. I stood frozen in the entryway, my hand still gripping the cold metal of the doorknob. The adrenaline spiked in my chest, sharp and immediate, a physical reaction to the impossible silhouette before me. My first thought was a break-in, a danger I could understand and fight. But then the figure moved, a slight, trembling adjustment of posture, and the street lamp filtering through the blinds caught the profile I had spent 2 years memorizing from the back of a lecture hall. The fear dissolved into something far more disorienting. "Dr. Thorne?" My voice sounded foreign in the quiet of my own home. She didn't answer immediately. She turned her head slowly, the movement lacking her usual predatory grace. The light revealed the devastation. Evelyn Thorne was known for her armor, the tailored suits, the hair pinned with architectural precision, the makeup that never smudged, regardless of the heat in the seminar room. But the woman shivering on my couch was a study in ruin. Her coat was soaked, dark patches of rain staining the beige wool. Her hair had escaped its pins, plastering wet strands against her pale neck. And her eyes, usually so piercing they could dissect an argument before you finished making it, were wide and glassy. Mascara had run in dark, jagged tracks down her cheeks. The sight felt like a violation. I wasn't supposed to see this. No one was. I stepped fully into the room, the door clicking shut behind me. The sound seemed to echo too loudly, emphasizing the sudden, suffocating intimacy of the space. My apartment was a graduate student's transient box, books stacked on the floor, a blanket thrown haphazardly over the chair, the lingering smell of burnt toast. It was a space of temporary existence. Evelyn Thorne belonged in boardrooms, in the mahogany-lined offices of the tenure track, in places where the lighting was designed to flatter power. Here, amidst my cheap furniture and shadows, she looked exposed. She started, but her voice failed. It was a broken sound, thin and brittle. I felt a war start in my chest. Part of me, the student, wanted to retreat, to offer a deferential apology for witnessing her weakness, and back out of the room until she composed herself. I wanted to offer her the dignity of distance. But the other part of me, the part that had watched her for months with a quiet, burning curiosity, felt a protective anger rise. She was shivering. The trembling wasn't subtle. It racked her entire frame, vibrating through the wet coat. "You're soaking wet," I said. The observation stupidly obvious, but it was the only thing my brain could formulate. "I didn't know where else to go," she whispered. The admission hung in the air, heavy and terrifying. The air between us felt charged, thick with the pressure of the storm outside and the unspoken disaster she had brought inside. I could smell the rain on her, a cold, metallic scent that clashed with the warmth of the apartment. I could hear the ragged hitch in her breathing, a desperate attempt to stabilize lungs that couldn't get enough air. She looked at me, and for the first time, the dynamic inverted. She wasn't looking down at me from a podium. She was looking up, her gaze raw and unflinching in its desperation. I realized then that I was still wearing my coat, still holding my keys as a weapon. I set them down on the small entry table, the metal clatter sharp in the silence. I needed to move. I needed to stop staring at the way the rainwater dripped from the hem of her coat onto my rug. The proximity was too much, the reality of her breakdown too visceral to process without a buffer. The silence stretched. "I'm going to make tea," I stated, my voice sounding far steadier than I felt. "Don't move." I turned away before she could protest, before she could try to reassemble the shattered pieces of her pride while I watched. I needed the sanctuary of the kitchen. I needed a wall between us, just for a moment, to understand why the most powerful woman I knew had run to me when her world fell apart. The kitchen offered a temporary ceasefire with reality. I filled the electric kettle, the sound of rushing water loud in the sudden quiet, and pressed the switch. It was a mundane, automatic act. The ritual of boiling water, selecting a tea bag, waiting for the click. But it was the only thing keeping my hands from shaking. I leaned against the counter, the cool laminate pressing into my lower back, and let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding since I unlocked the front door. The hum of the refrigerator and the rising hiss of the kettle were familiar, domestic sounds that usually signaled the end of a long day of study. Tonight, they felt like the soundtrack to a fever dream. From the darkened doorway, I watched her. It felt illicit, observing Dr. Thorne when she didn't know she was being seen. In the lecture hall, she was always performing. Posture perfect, gestures calculated, voice projected to the back row. She was a monolith of intellect and composure. But here, framed by the peeling paint of my kitchen door, she had slumped forward, elbows resting on her knees, face buried in her hands. The posture wasn't just tired, it was a total physical collapse. The wet wool of her coat bunched around her shoulders, heavy and dark. I noticed the way her fingers dug into her scalp, messing up the usually severe bun, pulling at the roots as if trying to physically extract the thoughts from her head. She looked small. That was the most terrifying part. Evelyn Thorne, who could silence a room full of arrogant academics with a single arched eyebrow, looked physically diminished by whatever catastrophe had driven her into the night. My own reflection in the darkened kitchen window caught my eye. Messy hair, oversized sweater, wide eyes. The contrast was laughable. She was the intruder in my sanctuary, shivering and broken, and I was the one making the tea. The realization made my chest ache with a strange, fierce protectiveness. I didn't want to be her equal in misery. I wanted to fix whatever had done this to her. "I'm sorry," she said. The voice drifted from the living room, so quiet I almost missed it over the rumble of the boiling water. It wasn't the voice I knew. The resonance was gone, replaced by a cracked, reedy timbre that sounded like it had been scraped raw. I stayed in the shadows for a second longer, watching her lift her head. She wasn't speaking to me, not really. She was speaking to the room, to the air, to the situation. "I had no right," she continued, the words tumbling out with a tremor. "This is unforgivable. To intrude on you like this. I just didn't know where the silence was." The kettle clicked off, the sound sharp and final. I poured the water, the steam rising in a hot cloud that smelled of bergamot and comfort. I grabbed 2 mugs, my favorite chipped blue one and a plain white spare, and dunked the tea bags. The clinking of the cheap ceramic sounded violent in the hush. I didn't bother with a tray. I didn't own one. I just gripped the warm handles, letting the heat seep into my cold palms, grounding me. "Dr. Thorne," I said, stepping out of the kitchen and crossing the threshold back into the living room. She flinched, just slightly, as if she had forgotten I was there. Or perhaps she was terrified I would ask her to leave. I walked toward her, closing the physical distance that had defined our relationship for years. I wasn't walking toward a podium. I was walking toward a woman on my thrift store sofa who looked like she might shatter if I moved too fast. I set the white mug down on the coffee table in front of her, the steam curling up between us like a signal fire. "Drink," I said softly, sitting on the edge of the armchair opposite her. "Please." She looked at the tea, then at me, her eyes searching my face for judgment. When she found none, she reached out, her hands trembling so badly that tea sloshed over the rim as she lifted the mug. She brought it to her lips like it was a lifeline. She held the mug with both hands, her knuckles white against the ceramic, as if the heat radiating from it was the only thing anchoring her to the earth. When she finally spoke, the words didn't come with the measured cadence of a lecture. They spilled out, fractured and raw, a dam breaking under the pressure of a flood. "They didn't just ask for my resignation," she said, her voice barely rising above the sound of the rain drumming against the window pane. "They wanted an erasure. A total redaction of the last 15 years. I sat in the armchair, my own tea forgotten on the floor beside me, and listened as she dismantled the events of the afternoon. I had expected a story of administrative error or a funding dispute, the usual bureaucratic violence of academia. But this was visceral. She described the department meeting not as a procedural event, but as an ambush. She spoke of the heavy oak doors of the dean's office closing, sealing her in with 5 people she had considered colleagues, mentors, even friends. "Marcus sat there," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the steam rising from her cup. He sat there and nodded while they questioned my integrity. He's used my research for 3 of his last 4 papers. He knows the rigor I demand. He knows. She didn't use legal terms. She didn't talk about bylaws or tenure clauses. She talked about the feeling of the air leaving the room. She talked about the way the dean wouldn't meet her eyes, focusing instead on a smudge on his mahogany desk while he delivered the sentence. They had accused her of compromising the department's reputation, a vague, suffocating charge that covered everything and nothing. It was a coup, plain and simple. The old guard, threatened by her brilliance and her refusal to play their political games, had finally found a way to cut her out. I listened, and a cold, hard knot of anger began to form in my stomach. I had heard the whispers in the library earlier that day, the excited, venomous hushes of students and faculty feasting on the downfall of a giant. They said she had snapped. They said she had been escorted out by security. The rumors painted her as unstable, a hysterical woman who couldn't handle the pressure. But looking at her now, seeing the devastation etched into the fine lines around her eyes, I realized the rumors were a convenient fiction. The reality was far more brutal. She hadn't snapped. She had been shattered by betrayal. "They took my keys," she said, a dry, humorless laugh escaping her lips. "Before I even left the room, like I was going to steal the staplers. 20 years of building that department, of bringing in grants, of shaping minds. And they treated me like a criminal because I refused to put my name on a paper I didn't write. The injustice of it made my skin prickle. I looked at this woman, this brilliant, formidable force who had taught me to dissect literature with surgical precision, and I felt a fierce, protective urge rise up in my throat. It was a dangerous feeling. It blurred the lines I had carefully maintained for 2 years. I wasn't just her student anymore. I was her witness. I wanted to storm the dean's office. I wanted to scream at Marcus. I wanted to wrap a blanket around her and tell her that none of them deserved her intellect anyway. I walked out of the building, Evelyn continued, her voice dropping lower, vibrating with an exhaustion that went deeper than bone. And I realized I didn't have anywhere to go. My apartment, it felt like a museum, full of awards they claim are tainted now, full of books written by the people who just stabbed me in the back. I couldn't breathe there. She finally looked up from her tea, meeting my eyes. The mask was completely gone. There was no professor left in the room, only a woman standing in the wreckage of her life, holding a cheap mug in a dark living room. "I drove for hours," she admitted. "I just drove in circles. I watched the gas gauge drop. I watched the rain start. And every time I tried to think of a safe harbor, a place where I wouldn't be the disgraced Dr. Thorne, my mind went blank." She paused, and the silence in the room grew heavy, charged with a new kind of tension. It wasn't the fear of the intruder anymore. It was the weight of the choice she had made. "I didn't choose this place by accident," she said, her voice barely a whisper, the confession hanging in the damp air between us. "I didn't come here because it was close. I came here because it was the only place on the map that felt quiet. Quiet." The word felt alien coming from her. In the hierarchy of my memory, Dr. Evelyn Thorne was never quiet. She was a force of nature, a distinct and terrifying frequency that vibrated through the floorboards of the humanities building. I looked at her trembling hands and was instantly transported back to the first time I saw her, 2 years ago. Modernist literature, Lecture Hall B. She hadn't just walked into the room, she had seized it. She wore a charcoal blazer that fit like armor and heels that clicked a sharp, authoritative rhythm against the linoleum. She didn't use a microphone. She didn't need one. Her voice had a crystalline, dangerous clarity that could slice through the stagnant air of the auditorium, silencing the rustle of notebooks and the whispers of hungover undergraduates in seconds. She would pace the stage like a panther stalking a thought, her energy restless and consuming. When she stopped to make a point, she would scan the room with that legendary, unflinching gaze. If her eyes landed on you, you felt pinned. It was an intellectual vivisection. You didn't want to look away. You wanted to be dissected. You wanted her to find something worth keeping inside your head. God, I had been so gone for her. It started as the standard academic worship, the grad student dazzled by the brilliant mentor. But it mutated quickly into something heavier, something I kept locked in a lead box in the back of my mind. It wasn't just her intellect, though that was intoxicating enough. It was the way she pushed her hair back when she was debating a point. It was the precise architecture of her hands when she held a text. It was the rare, fleeting half smile she offered when a student actually challenged her. A smile that said, "Finally, a pulse." I spent hours in the library, not studying, but replaying the cadence of her lectures, dissecting the way she said my name during roll call. It was a secret, suffocating crush that I buried under layers of professional deference and perfectly formatted footnotes. I was the diligent student in the second row. She was the icon. That was the deal. But looking at her now, shivering in my drafty living room, I realized the deal had always been a lie. There were cracks in the porcelain. I thought about the office hours, Tuesdays, 4 p.m. I was always the last one there. We would talk about Woolf or Joyce, dissecting the text, but the conversation always drifted. The air in that small, book-lined office would get heavy, charged with a static electricity that made the fine hairs on my arms stand up. She would lean back in her leather chair, the distance between us shrinking despite the desk, and ask me what I really thought. Not what the critics thought, what I thought, and the papers. The memory of her feedback made my stomach flip even now. Her comments in red ink weren't just corrections. They were a dialogue. "You pierce the veil here," she had scrawled once in the margin of my thesis draft, her handwriting sharp and jagged. "You see the hunger beneath the prose." I had stared at that sentence for 3 days. It felt like a secret correspondence, a coded language only we spoke. There was a subtext to our interactions, a lingering intensity that felt dangerous and illicit. I had convinced myself I was projecting, that I was reading desire into mentorship because I wanted it so badly. But she was here. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The charcoal blazer was gone, replaced by a soaked coat. The commanding voice was a whisper. But the woman was the same. She hadn't gone to her friends. She hadn't gone to her family. She hadn't gone to a hotel. When the world collapsed, she had driven through the rain to the apartment of the student who stayed too late on Tuesdays. I looked at the wet wool of her coat, the way her shoulders curved inward in defeat, and the contrast with the memory of her at the podium was heartbreaking. But beneath the heartbreak, something else was blooming, a terrifying, exhilarating confirmation. The red ink hadn't been a mistake. The tension in the office hadn't been one-sided. All those moments, all those echoes from the lecture hall, they were breadcrumbs. And they had led her, inevitably, to my door. "Quiet," I repeated, the word hanging between us like a question I hadn't fully asked. "You could have gone to a hotel, Evelyn. You have friends in the city. You have a sister in Connecticut." It was the first time I had used her first name without the title attached. It slipped out, unauthorized, a byproduct of the strange, suspended reality we were inhabiting. She didn't flinch. In fact, she seemed to lean into it, her shoulders dropping another fraction of an inch. "A hotel is anonymous," she murmured, her gaze drifting to the dark window where the rain was still blurring the world outside. And my sister, she would have offered sympathy. She would have made soup and told me that everything happens for a reason. I couldn't handle that. I couldn't handle the kindness of people who don't understand the magnitude of the loss. She turned back to me, and the intensity of her focus returned. It wasn't the predatory glare of the lecture hall, but something softer, heavier. "And the rumors," she said, her voice gaining a sudden, sharp edge. "You heard them? Of course you did. News travels faster than light in that department." "They said you snapped," I admitted, keeping my voice low. "They said the pressure finally broke the mechanism." "They're wrong," she said. The denial was instant, absolute. The pressure didn't break me. I've thrived on pressure for 20 years. Pressure is just physics. You push back. She took a breath, a shaky, rattling sound. "I didn't break because of the work, or the politics, or the exhaustion. I broke because I was compromised. They were right about that part. I haven't been there. Not really. Not for months." I watched her, confused. Dr. Thorne was the most present person I had ever known. She existed in a state of hyper-awareness. "I don't understand. You haven't missed a lecture in 6 years. You published 2 papers this semester." "Mechanics," she dismissed. waving a hand as if swatting away a fly. Muscle memory. I could teach modernism in my sleep. But my mind? My focus? She let out a dry, bitter laugh. It was drifting. It was leaking out. I made mistakes, sloppy errors in judgment, because I was distracted. I left openings for them to exploit because I was too busy looking elsewhere. Looking where? I asked. She looked down at her tea, watching the dark liquid swirl as she tilted the mug. I've been fighting a specific pull, she said softly, for nearly 2 years. A gravitational error. I told myself it was intellectual curiosity. I told myself it was mentorship. I told myself it was the simple pleasure of finding a student who actually read the syllabus. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, bird-like rhythm. I knew where this was going, but I was terrified to believe it. I needed her to say it. I needed the empirical data. But it wasn't mentorship, she continued, her voice dropping to a register that vibrated in the floorboards. It was interference. I would be in the middle of a faculty meeting, discussing budget allocations, and I would find myself wondering what you were thinking about the reading assignment. I would be writing a keynote speech, and I would stop, paralyzed, wondering if you were going to come to office hours that week. It was maddening. It was unprofessional. It was inevitable. The air in the room thickened, turning viscous and sweet. The smell of the rain and her presence seemed to expand, filling every corner of the small living room. You lost your department, I whispered, the realization dawning on me with terrifying clarity. Because you were distracted by me? I lost my department because I stopped caring about their approval, she corrected, finally lifting her eyes to meet mine. I stopped caring about the tenure committee. I stopped caring about the legacy. I realized, sitting in that meeting today while they stripped me of my titles, that the only opinion in the room I actually feared wasn't in the room. She paused, and the silence that followed was louder than the storm outside. I didn't come here for safety, she confessed, the words rushing out now, urgent and breathless. I didn't drive around for hours. I drove straight here. I sat in my car for 40 minutes, terrified, debating whether to turn the engine back on and disappear. But I couldn't. I didn't come here to hide, Garrett. She wasn't looking at me like a student anymore. The hierarchy was gone. The desk was gone. The grades were gone. There was only the woman, stripped of her armor, admitting that I was the reason the armor had failed in the first place. I came here, she whispered, because I couldn't stand to be anywhere you weren't. The confession hung between us, heavy and absolute. It changed the molecular structure of the room. I wasn't just comforting a mentor. I was facing a woman who had burned down her life to stand in my living room. Evelyn took a deep breath, her focus pinning me with a terrifying vulnerability. Then, with a deliberate, slow movement, she leaned forward and set her tea mug down on the coffee table. The ceramic clicked against the wood, a sharp, final sound that signaled the end of the conversation and the beginning of something else. She didn't lean back. She stayed there, poised on the edge of the sofa, waiting. The click of the ceramic mug against the wood table echoed like a gavel strike, signaling the end of the explanation and the beginning of the reality. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, filled with the sudden, suffocating awareness of how alone we were. The distance between the armchair and the sofa, perhaps 3 feet of worn carpet, suddenly felt like a canyon I had to bridge. Sitting across from her, elevated and separate, felt like a lie. It maintained the geometry of the office, the desk, the grade. And she had just told me she didn't want the grade. She wanted the coordinate. She wanted me. I couldn't look down at her anymore. I couldn't be the one in the position of comfort while she unraveled. Slowly, deliberately, I slid forward. I left the safety of the armchair, my movements quiet in the heavy silence, and lowered myself onto the narrow strip of rug between us. I didn't stop until I was kneeling, my jeans pressing against the floorboards, looking up at her. The shift in perspective was vertigo-inducing. For 2 years, Dr. Thorne had been a figure on a stage, a silhouette against a whiteboard, a voice thundering from above. Now, she was immediate. The space between us collapsed to inches. I could feel the heat radiating from her damp clothes, a feverish warmth that battled the chill of the storm outside. The air here, in the small space between her knees and my face, was different. It was tropical with tension. I could smell the complexity of her, not just the rain and the ozone, but the underlying notes of old paper, the sharp tang of anxiety, and that maddening, expensive sandalwood scent that I had chased down hallways for 4 semesters. It wasn't a perfume anymore. It was an atmosphere, and I was breathing it in, filling my lungs with the reality of her presence. She watched me move, her eyes tracking me with a focus that was no longer academic. It was the texture of her gaze that stopped my heart. In the classroom, her look was a spotlight, bright, exposing, interrogating. But here, in the shadows of my living room, her gaze was tactile. It felt like a physical weight resting on my skin. She was reading me, but not for a thesis statement. She was reading the flush rising in my neck, the rapid pulse visible in my throat, the way my hands were clenched on my thighs to keep from reaching out. Her own hands were resting on her knees, white-knuckled and trembling. I watched them. I watched the hands that had graded my papers with red ink, the hands that had gestured with such elegant violence during lectures on Joyce and Woolf, the hands I had fantasized about holding in moments I never admitted to myself. They looked fragile now, human. The nail polish on her thumb was chipped, a tiny, perfect imperfection that made my chest ache. She saw me looking. She saw the hunger I had spent 2 years starving, the adoration I had buried under footnotes and bibliographies. And for the first time in our history, she didn't deflect it. She moved. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was terrifyingly small. She unclasped her hands and reached out. The movement was slow, fighting the gravity of 1,000 ethical codes and university bylaws. Her fingers hovered for a second near my face, the air between skin and skin charged with a static so intense I almost flinched. Then she closed the gap. Her fingertips brushed my cheekbone. The contact was electric. It wasn't the cold professional handshake of a department mixer. It was warm, tentative, and devastating. The pads of her fingers traced the line in my jaw, a tactile question she was asking my skin. I stopped breathing. The world narrowed down to the point of contact. The rain outside ceased to exist. The scandal, the dean, the ruined career, they all evaporated. There was only the friction of her thumb against my pulse point. In that single touch, the syllabus burned. The hierarchy disintegrated. She wasn't Dr. Thorne anymore. She wasn't the mentor who held my future in her hands. She was Evelyn. She was a woman who had driven through a storm to find me, and now she was touching me like I was something precious, something she was terrified to break, but desperate to hold. I leaned into her hand. I couldn't help it. It was an instinct deeper than logic, deeper than survival. I turned my face slightly, pressing my cheek against her palm, closing my eyes to savor the texture of her skin. I heard her intake of breath, a sharp, ragged sound that mirrored my own internal collapse. This was the terrifying thrill I had run from, the realization that the obsession wasn't a crush. It was a recognition. And she was seeing me, finally, not as a student to be molded, but as a desire to be met. The wall was gone. We were just 2 women in the dark, and the pull was undeniable. "You have no idea," she breathed, the words ghosting across the scant inches between us. Her thumb brushed my cheekbone again, a slow, deliberate friction that sent a shiver racing down my spine. The terror of it, the absolute, paralyzing terror of standing at that podium, looking out at a sea of faces that wanted something from me. Grades, approval, a recommendation letter to Yale, and seeing the one person who just wanted to see me. Her voice was low, stripped of the lecture hall acoustics, intimate in a way that felt dangerous. It wasn't the voice of instruction. It was the voice of confession. "I saw you," she continued, her eyes reading mine, tracking the dilation of my pupils. "I saw the way you watched me when you thought I wasn't looking. I saw the way you held your pen, hovering over the page, not writing a single word because you were too busy tracking my movement across the stage. You didn't want the syllabus, Garrett. You wanted the source." My breath hitched. To hear it said aloud, to have the secret, suffocating desire I'd nursed for 4 semesters validated by the object of that desire, was overwhelming. "I thought I was invisible," I managed to whisper. "I thought I was just another face in the second row." "You were never just a face," she corrected, her fingers sliding down to cut my jaw, her palm warm and firm against my skin. You were the flaw in the design. My reputation, that unflinching persona the department loves to hate, it was a wall, a fortress I built, brick by brick, for 20 years to keep the chaos out, to keep people at a distance where they couldn't hurt me. I was untouchable because I made sure no one could get close enough to leave a mark. She leaned in closer, the scent of rain and proximity overwhelming my senses. And then you walked into my office 2 years ago, sat in that leather chair and looked at me with those eyes, and you just walked right through it. You didn't even knock. You didn't try to dismantle the wall. You just rendered it irrelevant. You made me want to step out from behind it. The admission hung in the air, heavy and sweet. The great Dr. Evelyn Thorne, the woman who terrified tenure committees and silenced auditoriums, was admitting that I, her student, her subordinate, had been the one to disarm her. I didn't want to be safe, I confessed, my voice trembling but gaining strength from the heat of her touch. I didn't come to office hours to talk about Wolf, Evelyn. I came because it was the only time you looked at me like I was real. I wrote those papers for you, not for the grade. I wanted to impress you. I wanted to be the one thing in your day that wasn't exhausting. Her eyes softened, the glassy look of shock replaced by a simmering, focused intensity. You were, she murmured. God, you were. Tuesdays at 4 o'clock became the only hour of the week I could breathe. And that scared me more than the scandal ever could. The realization that I would burn down my entire career just to keep you in that chair for 5 more minutes. The atmosphere in the room shifted, thickening into something sultry and undeniable. The rain outside was a distant white noise. The only reality was the heat radiating from her body, the way her gaze dropped to my mouth and lingered there. The intellectual crush, the professional admiration, it all incinerated, leaving only a raw, aching want. I'm not your student right now, I said, the words bold, a declaration of a new world order. I'm not the girl in the second row. No, she agreed, her voice dropping to a husk. Her hand moved from my jaw to the nape of my neck, her fingers tangling in the hair there, pulling me infinitesimally closer. You're the woman who opened the door when I had nowhere left to go. You're the only truth I have left. She looked at me then, really looked at me, with a vulnerability that stole the air from my lungs. There was only the terrifying, electric proximity of 2 women who had been circling each other for years, finally occupying the same orbit. Tell me to stop, she whispered, her lips inches from mine, the heat of her breath mingling with my own. Tell me this is a mistake. Tell me to go back to my car and drive away. I looked at her, the wet hair, the ruined makeup, the fierce, beautiful hope in her eyes, and I knew there was no going back. The syllabus was ash. Don't you dare, I whispered back. The distance between us didn't just close, it evaporated. When her lips finally met mine, it wasn't the tentative, experimental brush of a first encounter. It was a collision of intent, a desperate, necessary impact that tasted of bergamot tea and total surrender. For a fraction of a second, my brain tried to hold on to the impossible reality of it. That Dr. Evelyn Thorne, the woman who had terrified and captivated me from a podium for 2 years, was kissing me on the floor of my dimly lit apartment. But then the sensation took over, sweeping away the logic, the ethics, and the hesitation in a single, devastating wave. It was the precision of the act that floored me. Even in this, in the unraveling of her composure, she was exacting. Her mouth moved against mine with a terrifying clarity, demanding a response that I was all too ready to give. I felt the tension that had been coiled in her frame for hours, perhaps for years, release all at once. She made a sound, a low, broken noise in the back of her throat that vibrated against my lips, and that sound shattered the last of my restraint. My hands, which had been hovering uncertainly, found their way into her hair. The pins she used to secure that severe professional bun scattered onto the rug like hail, lost in the shadows. Her hair was damp and heavy, cool against my fingers, but the skin of her neck was burning. I pulled her closer, needing to eliminate even the air between us. The wet wool of her coat was rough against my wrists, a stark contrast to the softness of her skin, but I didn't care. I wanted the weight of her. I wanted the reality of her. She clung to me, That was the detail that would stay with me forever. The woman who stood alone against department heads and tenure committees was holding on to the front of my sweater with a grip so tight her knuckles must have been white. She wasn't leading this interaction. She was drowning in it. And I was the only solid thing in a world that had turned liquid. We were crossing a line that had been drawn in red ink and university bylaws for 2 years. Every policy, every professional boundary, every social norm was being incinerated by the heat radiating between us. And the terrifying part was how easy it was. It didn't feel like a transgression. It felt like a correction. It felt like the inevitable conclusion to every lingering glance in the hallway, every silence in her office that had stretched on a few seconds too long. I shifted, my knees pressing into the carpet, angling my body to deepen the contact. She followed the movement, her body fluid and responsive, stripping away the last remnants of the professor. There was just the friction of skin against skin, the desperate, hungry rhythm of our breathing, and the scent of her overwhelming my senses. I traced the line of her spine through her clothes, feeling the shudder that ran through her, and realized with a jolt of power that I was the cause. I had the ability to undo her, just as she had undone me. When we finally broke apart, it wasn't a retreat. We separated only inches, our foreheads resting against each other, sharing the same ragged air. Her eyes were closed, her lashes dark against her pale cheeks, and her lips were swollen, red, and thoroughly kissed. She looked wrecked, in the most beautiful way possible. The silence that settled over the room wasn't the heavy, awkward silence of before. It was a settled thing. The storm outside was still raging, hammering against the glass, but inside, the air was still. The energy had shifted from a frantic, high-frequency anxiety to a deep, resonant hum. I looked at her, at the way her hair fell in messy waves around her face, at the flush rising on her neck, and I knew. There was no going back. The syllabus was ash. I could never sit in the second row and take notes again. I could never raise my hand and wait for her permission to speak. We had rewritten the contract. The desk, the podium, the office, they belonged to a past life. "Evelyn," I whispered, the name tasting new and heavy on my tongue. She opened her eyes. The unflinching gaze was back, but the armor was gone. She looked at me with a raw, terrifying openness. "I know," she breathed, her hand coming up to cup my face, her thumb tracing my lower lip with a reverence that made my heart ache. "Everything is different now." The light that filtered into the apartment wasn't the harsh, fluorescent glare of the department hallway. It was the soft, apologetic gray of a Seattle dawn after a storm. It painted stripes across the worn rug where we had eventually fallen asleep, tangled together in a makeshift nest of blankets and exhaustion. The rain had stopped. The silence that filled the room now wasn't the heavy, suffocating tension of midnight. It was a settled, domestic quiet. The sound of a world that had shifted on its axis and found a new equilibrium. I watched her sleep for a moment. It felt like a transgression against the university handbook, but that book had been thrown out the window hours ago. Dr. Evelyn Thorne, the titan of the humanities department, looked incredibly human. Her hair was loose, fanned out against my couch cushion, and the tension that usually held her jaw in a tight line had softened. She didn't look like a scandal. She looked like a beginning. When she stirred, it wasn't with the panic I expected. She didn't wake up and immediately reach for her armor. She opened her eyes, blinking against the pale light, and when her gaze found mine, she didn't pull away. She smiled. It was a small, sleepy thing, unpracticed and unguarded, and it hit me harder than any lecture she had ever given. "It's morning," she rasped, her voice rough with sleep. "It is," I whispered back, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "And the sky didn't fall." "Oh, the sky fell," she corrected softly, shifting so her head rested against my shoulder. The movement was easy, instinctive. "My career is currently rubble. By noon, the emails will be circulating. The dean will have drafted a statement about upholding standards. My tenure is history." She said it without a trace of the bitterness that had laced her voice the night before. There was a strange lightness to her tone, an almost giddy relief. She wasn't mourning the loss of the tower. She was marveling at the view from the ground. "Are you okay?" I asked, my hand finding hers in the tangle of blankets. I should be terrified, she admitted, looking at our joined hands. I have no title. I have no office. I am currently waking up in my grad student's living room in yesterday's clothes. She paused, and her grip tightened on my fingers. But I feel free. I feel like I've been holding my breath for 20 years, terrified that if I exhaled, I'd lose my edge. But I didn't lose it. I just stopped pointing it at myself. We lay there as the city woke up around us, the distant hum of traffic replacing the thunder. We talked about the logistics, the resignation letter, the inevitable gossip, the movers. But the conversation had changed. It wasn't a mentor instructing a student on how to handle a crisis. It was two equals mapping out a strategy. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had dissolved. She wasn't the professor anymore. She was Evelyn. And I wasn't the girl in the second row. I was the partner who had opened the door. I'll probably have to transfer, I realized aloud. Or leave the program. They won't let this fly. Let them try to stop us, she said. And the old steel was back in her voice, but it was tempered with warmth. We'll write our own syllabus. I'm done with theirs. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the wet pavement shining in the sun. She wasn't the broken woman who had hidden in the dark. She stood with her spine straight, strengthened not by the institution, but by the truth we had found in the wreckage. The worst night of her professional life had burned everything down, only to reveal the foundation of something real. If you believe that sometimes you have to lose the life you planned to find the one you need, subscribe for more.